Welcome to Scenario, the podcast deep dive with critics, reviews, and new ideas. Today, you're joining us for, well, a really expansive exploration. We're plunging into the deep waters of United States history.
That's right. We're using a detailed transcript from a comprehensive YouTube documentary as our guide.
Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to understanding the key moments, the undercurrents that shaped a nation. We're going from its colonial beginnings way up to the late 20th century.
And our mission, if you like, is to go beyond just a simple timeline. We want to pull out those pivotal turning points.
Yeah, the surprising details, maybe, things that shift your understanding.
Exactly. And the fundamental themes that weave through this pretty complex stories. So let's set the stage way back, before America was even really a concept. Think about the initial European powers staking their claims.
Okay, let's maybe forget the traditional Thanksgiving story for just a second and think about, say, the Dutch.
Yeah, the Dutch, often overlooked, like you said. Back in 1614, they set up New Netherlands. It was mostly about trade.
So small outposts along the Hudson, the East River, that kind of thing?
Pretty much. Small scale initially. But what's fascinating is the foundation they laid for what became, well, a massive global hub.
Right, you mean New York.
Exactly. Their purchase of Manhattan Island in 1624, yes, for that legendary $24, though the value is debated, and setting up New Amsterdam at the southern tip. That was the groundwork.
A trading colony, great location, access to rivers, almost destined for big things commercially.
Yeah, but that prime location also made it a target.
Right, because the English wanted that Hudson River access too, so it wasn't exactly a peaceful handover.
Oh no, by 1664, English ships just sailed into the harbor. There was some resistance, but the Dutch eventually surrendered.
So a big power shift. New Amsterdam becomes New York.
And a really key piece in the expanding British colonial puzzle. But the Dutch were just one piece of this early picture. We need to talk about the Spanish, too.
Okay, the Spanish down in the southeast. St. Augustine, right? That predates a lot of the English settlements we usually focus on.
Way earlier, yeah. St. Augustine was founded in 1565. Their focus was, driven by exploration, looking for wealth, and spreading Catholicism.
And their influence went beyond Florida, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It stretched across much of the present-day Southwest California. You can still see that lasting cultural and architectural legacy today. It's a reminder of their early dominance in those areas.
Okay, so Dutch in the northeast, Spanish in the southeast, then the French. They were focused more up north, St. Lawrence River, looking for that Northwest Passage.
Right. Quebec, Montreal, those were their hubs. Their approach was a bit different. They built this really extensive fur trade network.
And alliances with Native American tribes were crucial for them, weren't they?
Absolutely key. They aimed to control the interior waterways, especially the Mississippi, which led them all the way down to founding New Orleans.
Wow, so imagine like a chain of settlements from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf.
That's the idea, all connected by the river system. But of course, this created friction both with other Europeans and, importantly, with the native populations.
So you've got Dutch, Spanish, French, all competing, bumping up against each other, and crucially, impacting the people already living there. It sounds like a recipe for conflict.
It was, and many Native American tribes were incredibly skilled at navigating this, forming alliances, resisting when they needed to. It was a complex web.
Which brings us to something like King Philip's War in 1675. That sounds like a major turning point, a breakdown of some of those earlier, maybe more peaceful relationships.
Definitely a breakdown. You have growing colonial settlements, more demand for land. Metacomet, who the English called King Philip, leader of the Wampanoag.
His father, Massasoit, had actually helped the Pilgrims initially.
Exactly. But Metacomet saw the threat. Disputes over land, livestock, English law being imposed. It just reached a boiling point.
And it wasn't just the Wampanoag involved.
No, he built a significant intertribal alliance with other Algonquin-speaking peoples. They launched really devastating attacks across New England. Whole towns were destroyed.
It showed how vulnerable the colonies still were.
And the fierce resistance. But the colonial response was, well, equally brutal.
What are the long-term consequences?
It was incredibly destructive for everyone, but catastrophic for the native population in New England. Metacomet was killed, the Wampanoag and their allies were decimated, their power essentially broken. It really solidified English dominance there.
One of the deadliest wars relative to population in early American history, I've read.
That's right. And it laid bare all these tensions, setting the stage for more conflict, not just with Native Americans, but between the European powers themselves, France and England especially.
Right, these European rivalries playing out over here. King William's War, starting in 1689.
Yeah, and you see how it pulls everyone in. The English allied Iroquois attacking French settlements, the French allied Wabanaki Confederacy raiding English ones, indigenous groups drawn into these larger imperial conflicts.
So colonial militias, native allies, all deeply involved, fighting mostly on the frontiers.
Primarily. Hudson River Valley, Acadia, which is now Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, trying to weaken each other, grab territory, control trade routes. These early wars didn't always have a clear winner over here, but they definitely shifted claims and militarized the colonies more.
Then Queen Anne's War, early 1700s, another European conflict spilling over.
And you see it playing out differently in different regions. In the South, English colonists from Carolina fighting Spanish in Florida, French in Louisiana. Up north, the Wabanaki, again siding with the French, raiding New England.
It really shows how connected everything was, globally and locally. What came out of that war, territorially?
The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 was a pretty big win for the British. They got Acadia, Newfoundland, Hudson Bay territory from France. It weakened the French in eastern Canada.
But the tensions didn't just disappear.
No, they just simmered. There was a bit of a lull for a few decades. The colonies grew, became more valuable.
Which just raised the stakes for the next round.
Absolutely. More valuable colonies, fueled partly by the horrific transatlantic slave trade, made control of North America an even bigger prize. Competition ramped up.
Okay, which brings us to the big one. The French and Indian War. Part of the 7 Years' War, but this one really started here, didn't it?
It did. Kicked off over control of the Ohio River Valley. Both Britain and France claimed it. And it starts with a young George Washington leading Virginia militia actually clashing with French forces in 1754.
Just a small skirmish initially, but it blew up fast.
It really did. Drew both empires into a full-scale war for the continent. And initially, things didn't go so well for the British.
Right, the French and their native allies had some early successes. What changed?
Well, the British government started pouring more resources, more military power into North America, and crucially, some internal conflicts and shifting alliances weakened French support on native tribes. Plus, the British scored key victories like capturing Quebec in 1759. That was huge.
A massive blow to French power. So the British win in 1763. What did the map look like after the Treaty of Paris?
Radically different. Britain got all of Canada, plus the Louisiana territory east of the Mississippi from France. Spain, who had allied with France late, gave Florida to Britain. Huge expansion for the British Empire. French colonial power in North America was basically done.
But victory came with a price tag. Massive war debt for Britain.
Exactly. And that victory also, ironically, planted the seeds for the next conflict, this time with their own colonists.
Starting with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It was meant to stop conflict with Native Americans, but it really ticked off the colonists. Why?
Because it drew a line along the Appalachian Mountains and said, basically, colonists don't settle west of here. That land is reserved for native tribes.
And the colonists felt they'd earned the right to move west.
They absolutely did. They saw it as a betrayal, more British control they didn't want. Resentment started building.
And that resentment just grew as Britain tried to raise money and control the colonies after the war. It wasn't just about the money, though, was it? It was about who had the right to tax them.
That's the core issue. No taxation without representation. They argued, we don't elect anyone to Parliament, so Parliament can't tax us directly. The British government disagreed, obviously. They felt they had authority.
So we see things like the Sugar Act in 64, then the Stamp Act in 65. How did the colonists push back?
Boycotts are huge. Boycotting British goods. They formed groups like the Sons of Liberty, political organizing like the Stamp Act Congress. And, well, it worked initially. The boycotts hit Britain's economy, and they repealed the Stamp Act.
But they didn't back down on the principle.
Nope. Parliament passed the Declaratory Act right after, basically saying, just so you know, we still have the right to make laws for you, including taxes. The underlying tension was still there.
And sure enough, more taxes followed. The Townshend Acts in 67, taxing things like lead, glass, paper, tea.
And the response was similar. More boycotts, more activism. Things got heated, especially in places like Boston. That led to incidents like the Boston Massacre in 1770.
Which wasn't a huge battle, but it became a powerful symbol, right? Propaganda-wise.
Absolutely. A symbol of British tyranny in the eyes of many colonists. Paul Revere's engraving, was very effective.
Things cooled off a tiny bit after that,
Mm.
but then came the Tea Act in 1773, which seems weird because it actually made tea cheaper, didn't it?
It did, technically, but the colonists saw it as a trick, a way to get them to buy the taxed tea and therefore implicitly accept Parliament's right to tax them. It was about the principle.
And the result was the Boston Tea Party.
Yep. Sons of Liberty dressed as Native Americans, dumping thousands of pounds of tea into the harbor, a very direct act of defiance. Cost a lot of money, too, even back then. Something like $1.7 million in today's money.
Britain's reaction was not subtle. The Intolerable Acts of 1774.
Right. They were designed specifically to punish Massachusetts and clamp down. They closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, restricted town meetings, allowed British officials accused of crime to be tried elsewhere, and strengthened the Quartering Act.
How did the other colonies react to Massachusetts being punished like that?
It actually unified them. They saw it as an attack on all colonial liberties. If Britain could do this to Massachusetts, they could do it to anyone. This led directly to the First Continental Congress.
They met, they petitioned the king, but ultimately that didn't work.
No, the petitions were rejected. And that really set the stage for armed conflict. Which brings us to April 1775, Lexington and Concord.
The shot heard around the world. Paul Revere's ride.
William Dawes, too. But yeah, that clash between colonial militia, the Minutemen, and British regulars, that was the start of the Revolutionary War. From political protest to actual fighting.
And the news spread like wildfire. The Second Continental Congress convened soon after. Was independence the immediate goal?
Not necessarily for everyone right at first. There was still some hope for reconciliation. They sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III.
But he rejected it.
Rejected it outright. Declared the colonies in rebellion. That, plus the ongoing fighting, really pushed more and more delegates towards independence. The feeling of a separate American identity was growing too.
And that led to July 4th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence, mostly written by Jefferson.
Right. And its core ideas: all men are created equal, endowed with rights like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, government deriving power from the consent of the governed. These were radical, revolutionary ideas.
And it fundamentally changed the war, right? It wasn't just about taxes anymore.
Exactly. It was a fight for a whole new nation based on those principles, a much bigger deal.
But the early years of the war itself, they were tough for Washington and the Continental Army.
Oh, incredibly tough. The army was often short on everything: supplies, food, training. It was a mix of militias. Enlistments were short. They suffered big defeats early on, like losing New York City. The invasion of Quebec failed too.
But Washington managed to keep the cause alive. Were there any key early victories that boosted morale?
Definitely. His surprise attacks across the Delaware River at Trenton and then Princeton late in 76 were absolute crucial. They came when things looked really bleak, showed the British could be beaten, kept the army together.
Okay, then 1777. The British tried a strategy to cut off New England. They took Philadelphia.
Which was the capital, symbolically important. But their other army, coming down from Canada under General Burgoyne, got bogged down and surrounded at Saratoga.
And Saratoga was a huge turning point, wasn't it? Why?
Because the American victory there, forcing a whole British army to surrender, convinced France that the Americans might actually win.
Ah, so that led to the French alliance.
Directly. In 1778, France formally allied with the U.S., providing desperately needed money, troops, and especially naval power. Spain and the Netherlands eventually joined in against Britain too. It became a world war.
Before the French fully arrived, though, there was the winter at Valley Forge, infamous for hardship.
Terrible conditions: starvation, disease, lack of supplies. But it was also a time of transformation.
How so?
Washington, with help from foreign officers like Baron von Steuben from Prussia and the Marquis de Lafayette from France, used that winter to train the army. They drilled constantly, instilled discipline. The army that came out of Valley Forge was much more professional.
So the war drags on. The British shift their focus south, hoping for more loyalist support there.
Right. They captured Savannah, Charleston. It looked bad for a bit, but American General Nathaniel Greene took command in the South.
And he did things differently.
Very differently. He used guerrilla tactics, worked with local militias, avoided big pitched battles he couldn't win, wore the British down. Battles like Kings Mountain and Cowpens were important American victories, often fought by militia and frontiersmen, that really hurt the British strategy.
And eventually it all leads to Yorktown in 1781. How did that final victory come together?
It was a combination of factors. Washington and the French General Rochambeau marched their combined forces south very quickly. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed up and crucially defeated the British fleet, blocking any escape or resupply for the British Army under Cornwallis at Yorktown.
So Cornwallis was trapped.
Completely trapped on that peninsula. Land forces besieging him, French Navy blocking the sea. After a few weeks of siege, he had no choice but to surrender his entire army.
And that was basically the end of the major fighting.
Pretty much. It took 2 more years to negotiate the peace treaty, but Yorktown sealed the American victory. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally recognized U.S. independence.
An incredible achievement. But then comes the hard part. Building a nation. They started with the Articles of Confederation. What was the problem there?
The Articles created a very weak central government. It could declare war, make treaties, but it couldn't really tax effectively or regulate commerce between the states. Each state was almost like its own little country.
Which led to problems.
Big problems. States argued over borders, trade. The national government couldn't pay its debts, couldn't manage the economy. It was pretty chaotic.
And Shays' Rebellion in 1786 really highlighted these weaknesses, didn't it? Farmers revolting in Massachusetts.
Exactly. The government under the Articles couldn't effectively respond. It scared a lot of the elite, the leaders. It showed the need for a stronger national government that could maintain order and stability.
So that fear, those problems, led to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787.
Right. Initially, the idea was just to revise the Articles, but they ended up scrapping them entirely and creating a whole new framework to the Constitution.
Which was ratified in 1788, creating a much stronger federal government with distinct branches: legislative, executive, judicial.
Checks and balances, separation of powers, a radical new form of government for its time, and George Washington became the first president in 1789.
Setting precedents must have been a huge part of his job.
Absolutely. Everything he did set an example, establishing the cabinet, navigating early economic challenges with Alexander Hamilton's planned tariffs, a national bank.
That national bank was controversial, wasn't it?
Very. It highlighted early divisions between Hamilton's Federalists, who wanted a strong central government and commercial economy, and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, who favored states' rights and an agrarian society. Washington also faced the Whiskey Rebellion.
Farmers protesting a tax on whiskey.
Right. And Washington personally led troops to put it down, showing the new government would enforce its laws. He also dealt with tricky foreign policy, the French Revolution, British impressment of sailors, negotiating the Jay Treaty with Britain.
And famously warned against political parties in his farewell address, which, of course, didn't happen.
No, the party system developed quickly. John Adams, a Federalist, followed Washington. His presidency was tough: the quasi-war with France, the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts clamping down on dissent.
Then Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, wins in 1800. His big move was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803.
Doubled the size of the country overnight, bought it from Napoleon. Huge implications for westward expansion.
And he sent Lewis and Clark to explore it, right? With Sacagawea's help.
That's right. An incredible journey mapping the new territory. But Jefferson also faced challenges from the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, leading to the unpopular Embargo Act, trying to avoid conflict.
Which didn't really work. And that brings us to his successor, James Madison, and the War of 1812. What pushed the U.S. into another war with Britain?
A few things. British impressment forcing American sailors into the Royal Navy was a major grievance. Trade restrictions hurt the U.S. economy. And there was this desire among some, the war hawks like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, to expand, maybe take Canada. Plus, ongoing suspicion the British were backing Native American resistance on the frontier, like Tecumseh's Confederacy.
The war itself was kind of a mixed bag, wasn't it? Some highs, some lows.
Definitely. The U.S. invasion of Canada failed. The British burned Washington, D.C., including the White House. But there were American naval victories, like the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides. And the defense of Fort McHenry inspired the Star-Spangled Banner.
And the Battle of New Orleans with Andrew Jackson, even though it happened after the peace treaty was signed?
Yeah, technically after, but a huge morale boost. What were the real consequences of the war?
Well, it didn't change borders much, but it did foster a stronger sense of American nationalism. It kind of confirmed independence on the world stage. It also pretty much ended significant Native American resistance east of the Mississippi and damaged the Federalist Party, which had opposed the war.
Okay, so the U.S. emerges more confident. And the 19th century becomes really defined by westward expansion, fueled by this idea of manifest destiny.
Right, this belief that the U.S. was destined to stretch across the continent. But that expansion came at a terrible cost for Native Americans.
Tragically so. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 under Andrew Jackson led to the forced relocation of the 5 civilized tribes: Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole from the southeast.
The Trail of Tears.
A horrific journey, thousands died, a brutal chapter in U.S. history.
And expansion also led to conflict with Mexico,
Yeah.
the Mexican-American War, 1846-48.
Driven by manifest destiny and disputes over Texas annexation. The U.S. won decisively, acquiring a vast amount of territory: California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, the present-day Southwest.
But all that new land immediately brought up the most divisive issue: slavery. Would it be allowed in these new territories?
Exactly. It reignited the debate that had been simmering. Attempts to compromise, like the Missouri Compromise earlier or the Compromise of 1850, including the Fugitive Slave Act, just kicked the can down the road.
Things got uglier with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, leading to Bleeding Kansas.
Yeah, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushing in, fighting literal battles. Then you had the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court, basically saying black people weren't citizens and Congress couldn't ban slavery in territories, and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry.
Trying to start a slave uprising. He was seen as a martyr by abolitionists, a terrorist by the South.
It just polarized the country even further. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery was the final straw for the South.
South Carolina seceded first, others followed. And then the attack on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, April 12, 1861.
That was the start of the Civil War, 4 years of brutal conflict.
The Union had industrial strength, more people. The Confederacy had strong military leadership early on, fighting on home turf.
Right. Early on, Confederate generals like Robert E. Lee had a lot of success in the Eastern Theater. But in the West, Union General Ulysses S. Grant started making headway, securing control of the Mississippi River with the capture of Vicksburg.
And Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 was a huge turning point, wasn't it? Morally and strategically.
Absolutely. It shifted the war's purpose explicitly towards ending slavery, not just preserving the Union. It also allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army, which they did in large numbers, providing crucial manpower.
Then came Gettysburg in July 63. Lee's invasion of the North turned back.
A massive, bloody battle. Lee's defeat there, combined with Grant's victory at Vicksburg around the same time, is often seen as the turning point of the war. The Confederacy couldn't really recover offensively after that.
Grant eventually took command of all Union armies. Sherman's destructive march to the sea through Georgia.
Aimed at breaking the South's will and ability to fight. Finally, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, April 9, 1865.
The war was over, but just days later, Lincoln was assassinated.
A national tragedy. And it meant Reconstruction, the process of rebuilding the South and integrating formerly enslaved people, would happen under Andrew Johnson, who had very different ideas than Lincoln.
Reconstruction saw some major achievements, like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
Crucial amendments: abolishing slavery, granting citizenship and equal protection, and guaranteeing voting rights for black men. Huge steps forward.
But it also faced massive resistance in the South.
Fierce resistance. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and intimidation. Southern states enacted black codes to restrict freedom, and eventually Northern political will faded.
Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, and what followed was the era of Jim Crow.
Yeah, decades of legal segregation, disenfranchisement through poll taxes and literacy tests, widespread discrimination, and violence against African Americans. A long and difficult period.
Meanwhile, the late 19th century saw a continued westward expansion. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869.
Connected the country, but also led to more conflict with Native American tribes on the plains, the Sioux Wars, Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee, and the romanticized image of the Wild West, Wyatt Earp, the OK Corral.
This whole period is often called the Gilded Age. Looks shiny on the surface, but lots of problems underneath.
Right. Incredible industrial growth, massive fortunes built by people like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, huge waves of immigration providing labor, but also terrible working conditions, child labor, vast inequality, political corruption.
Labor started organizing, leading to strikes like the Pullman strike with Eugene V. Debs.
Yeah, often met with violent suppression. It highlighted the deep tensions between capital and labor.
Then, coming into the early 20th century, we get the Progressive Era, a reaction against the Gilded Age.
Largely, yes. A desire for reform, social, economic, political. You have Theodore Roosevelt as president, known for trust busting, trying to break up monopolies, and also conservation efforts setting aside national parks.
And social reformers like Jane Addams with Hull House muckraking journalists exposing problems, the fight for women's suffrage gaining momentum.
But it wasn't progressive for everyone. Racial tensions were still incredibly high. Jim Crow laws were firmly in place in the South. Black voters were systematically disenfranchised. The KKK saw a resurgence, and there was horrific violence, like lynchings and race riots like the Red Summer after WWI.
And this era also saw the U.S. becoming more assertive globally. Expansionism.
Definitely. Annexation of Hawaii after overthrowing Queen Luluokalani. The Spanish-American War in 1898.
Triggered by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana.
Right, led to the U.S. acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from Spain. But then came a brutal conflict, the Philippine-American War, as Filipinos fought for independence from U.S. rule.
And the Panama Canal. A huge engineering feat, but also controversial in how the U.S. acquired the rights.
Very controversial, involving U.S. support for Panamanian independence from Colombia. But the canal was strategically and commercially vital.
Okay. Moving into the next big global conflict, World War I. The U.S. tried to stay neutral at first.
For almost 3 years, Wilson campaigned on keeping the U.S. out. But German unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking ships like the Lusitania, and the Zimmermann telegram Germany trying to get Mexico to attack the U.S. eventually pulled America in 1917.
And American troops and resources made a difference on the Western Front.
They did, particularly in halting the final German offensives in 1918, like the Meuse-Argonne offensive. After the war, Wilson proposed his 14 points for peace, including a League of Nations.
But the U.S. never joined the League, did it?
No. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, a return to a more isolationist stance for a while.
Which led into the Roaring Twenties, a time of big economic boom, but also huge social change.
Yeah, rapid urbanization, more people living in cities than rural areas for the first time, changing roles for women, consumer culture taking off, cars, radios.
Yes, music, the Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of African-American culture.
Absolutely, but also cultural clashes. Prohibition led to organized crime. There was still massive wealth inequality despite the surface prosperity, and nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment, was strong.
And then the bottom fell out. The stock market crash of 1929
plunged the U.S. and much of the world into the Great Depression. Decade of immense hardship, unemployment soaring, poverty widespread. The Dust Bowl on the Great Plains made things even worse for farmers.
Franklin D. Roosevelt comes in, elected in 32, the New Deal.
A massive expansion of the federal government's role, programs like Social Security, public works projects, WPA, CCC, regulations on banks and the stock market, aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. Didn't end the Depression entirely, but provided crucial support and changed the relationship between Americans and their government.
Meanwhile, globally, things were getting dangerous again. Fascism rising in Europe, Japan expanding in Asia.
Right. The U.S. tried to maintain neutrality again as WWII began in Europe, but Roosevelt supported the Allies through things like the Lend-Lease program, providing weapons and supplies.
Until Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941.
A date which will live in infamy. The Japanese attack brought the U.S. directly into World War II. Massive mobilization followed industry converted to war production. Millions enlisted or were drafted.
A dark side of that mobilization was the internment of Japanese Americans.
Yes, Executive Order 9066. Over 100,000 people, mostly citizens, forced from their homes into camps based purely on ancestry. A major civil liberties violation.
The war was fought on multiple fronts. Europe, North Africa, the Pacific.
Huge campaigns. In the Pacific, the turning point was the Battle of Midway. Then the brutal island-hopping campaigns, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. In North Africa, Operation Torch. In Europe, the D-Day landings in Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge. Millions served. Enormous sacrifices were made.
And the war ended with the atomic bombs.
The Manhattan Project developed the bomb. The U.S. dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima and Fat Man on Nagasaki in August 1945. Japan surrendered shortly after, ended the war, but ushered in the nuclear age and raised profound moral questions.
WWII ends, but almost immediately a new conflict emerges. The Cold War.
Yeah, tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, former allies, escalated rapidly. Ideological conflict, capitalism versus communism, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. The U.S. adopted a policy of containment.
Which led to involvement in conflicts like the Korean War in the early 50s.
Right. And the nuclear arms race, the space race triggered by Sputnik, a period of global tension, proxy wars, fear of nuclear annihilation.
Domestically, though, another major struggle was gaining momentum. The Civil Rights Movement.
Building on decades of activism, the movement gained force in the 50s and 60s. Key moments like the NAACP's legal challenges, the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision desegregating schools in '54.
The Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks, led by Martin Luther King Jr.
The rise of nonviolent direct action. Sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom rides challenging segregation in interstate travel, facing down brutal resistance, like in Birmingham with the Children's Crusade.
The March on Washington in '63, King's I Have a Dream speech.
Powerful moments that galvanized public opinion and pressured the federal government, leading to landmark legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing discrimination, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, protecting suffrage. Huge victories, though the struggle for equality continued.
But this period also saw the U.S. get bogged down in another major conflict, Vietnam.
Yeah, U.S. involvement escalated throughout the '60s, based on Cold War containment policy, trying to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder, massive bombing campaigns, hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops deployed.
But it became incredibly divisive at home.
Hugely divisive, a growing anti-war movement, fueled by the draft, mounting casualties, televised images of the war's brutality, incidents like the My Lai massacre, revelations like the Pentagon Papers. It tore the country apart.
Eventually, the U.S. withdrew its troops, and Saigon fell to North Vietnam in 1975. A painful chapter.
Very painful, long-lasting impacts on American society, foreign policy, and trust in government. The Cold War itself eventually wound down, though. The fall of the Berlin Wall in '89, the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91.
Wow. Okay, that is an extraordinary journey through centuries of American history. From those early settlements through revolutions, wars, massive social changes.
Expansion, conflict, the struggle for rights, the evolving idea of what America is. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, hopefully diving into this gives you, our listeners, some maybe surprising insights, a deeper feel for the forces that have shaped the U.S.
Absolutely. It's such a dynamic, complex story, so many achievements, but also profound challenges and contradictions. Understanding this past is, well, pretty essential for understanding the present, don't you think?
Definitely. So as you think about everything we've covered, maybe consider this. How do the echoes of these events, the triumphs, the struggles, the unresolved issues, how do they continue to resonate today in America and its role in the world?
That's a really important question to reflect on.
This is all. Thank you, and to the next podcast.